There are things about our family land that nobody ever wanted to talk about. Not my stepfather, not my two older stepbrothers, not the county clerk who stamped the papers of mourning. They put my name on a list of people who didn't matter. But the land knew. The land had been keeping score for almost 70 years, and one cold October afternoon, when I was 17 years old and standing at the edge of a gravel road with a garbage bag of clothes and $42 in my jeans pocket, the land finally decided it was ready to speak. My name is Hannah Ruth Merrick. I was born on a 160-acre farm outside a town called Coldwater, in a part of the country where the wheat grows tall in summer and the wind cuts straight through you in winter. My mother died when I was 11. My father, a soft-spoken man who'd inherited the land from his own father, remarried a woman named Doreen 2 years after that. And 2 years after Doreen came her boys, Cole and Travis, 18 and 20 at the time, both of them born with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to earn anything. My father passed away when I was 15, a stroke in the back pasture while he was fixing a fence line. I found him at sundown, his hand still curled around a pair of wire pliers, his eyes open to a sky that had already gone dark behind him. I sat with him for an hour before I could make my legs work well enough to walk back to the house. After that, everything changed, and nothing changed, depending on who you asked. Doreen told the neighbor she was holding things together for the girl. She said it in that soft, tired voice women use when they want to be admired. But inside our house, the voice was different. Inside, I was the one holding things together. Up before dawn to feed the chickens, out in the barn before school to milk the one remaining Jersey cow my father had kept for sentiment, home again in the afternoon to haul water, stack wood, mend whatever Cole or Travis had broken since breakfast. I want to tell you something about that house. Something I didn't understand until much later. My grandfather built it with his own hands in 1954. His name was Elias Merrick, and he'd come back from Korea with a limp in his right leg and a quiet way of looking at the world that I've never seen in another living person. He didn't drink. He didn't go to church much. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the wheat move in the wind like he was reading something written there in a language only he understood. My grandfather died when I was 9, 2 years before my mother. But in those 9 years, he taught me more than any teacher, any pastor, any book I ever read in school. He taught me how to listen to the land, how to know when the soil was tired, how to feel a change in the weather 3 days before it came. He taught me the name of every creek and gully on our property, and he taught me a word I never heard anyone else use: stewardship. "Hannah girl," he'd say, sitting on the porch with his bad leg propped on a crate. "This land isn't ours. We're just the ones who get to watch it for a while. If we do it right, the ones who come after us get to watch it too." I didn't understand then. I was 9. I thought he meant we had to keep the weeds down and the fences mended. It took me another 8 years to understand what he was actually saying. Let me tell you a few things about my grandfather, because he matters to the story more than anyone else in it. And you can't understand what happened on that gravel road the day I got thrown out unless you first understand the man who raised my father on that same piece of ground. Elias Merrick was born in 1928 in a sod-roof farmhouse about 40 miles west of where our homestead sits now. He was one of 7 children. 3 of them didn't make it past the age of 10. 2 to the flu and 1 to a plow accident that my grandfather, as a small boy, had witnessed and never spoke of for the rest of his life. He went to school through the 8th grade. He could read and write and do arithmetic. And he taught himself land law out of a set of second-hand volumes he bought at a county auction in 1953 for 45 cents. He served in Korea from 1950 to 1952. He came home with a limp that he never explained and a quietness he never shook. He married my grandmother in 1953. Her name was Eleanor, the same name I gave my daughter, and she was a small woman with dark hair and a laugh my father used to imitate sometimes, on the rare nights when he had a drink after supper and got to reminiscing. She died of a fast cancer in 1994, when my father was still a young man. My grandfather lived alone in the house after that for another 21 years. He never remarried. He never took much interest in any woman after her. He would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the wheat, and sometimes my father would find him talking quietly to somebody who wasn't there, and my father learned not to interrupt. I tell you these things because I want you to understand that the man who left a yellowed page in a footlocker for a girl who hadn't been born yet was not an eccentric. He was not a hoarder. He was not a man given to grand gestures or to theatrical forethought. He was a farmer who had survived a war, who had buried a wife, who had raised a son, who had lost siblings as a child, and who had learned, from all of it, that the world takes things away from you whether or not you are prepared. His response was to prepare anyway, quietly, methodically, in block letters on plain paper, folded into quarters, filed in a footlocker under a tarp. Stewardship. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. This story is going to take some turns, and I want you walking them with me. After my father died, Doreen brought in a lawyer from the county seat, a thin man with a thin mustache named Mr. Alden, and the four of us sat around the kitchen table while he explained that my father had died intestate. No will, nothing in writing. And under the laws of our state, when a man dies without a will and leaves behind a spouse and a child, the spouse takes a life estate in the homestead, and the remainder passes to the child. I didn't know what any of those words meant. I was 15. I was sitting at the same kitchen table where my father used to pour me coffee on Sunday mornings, and a stranger was telling me my inheritance in a voice like he was reading a weather report. But Doreen understood. I saw it in her face. A small tightening at the corners of her mouth. A quick flick of her eyes toward Cole, who was leaning against the kitchen counter eating an apple. A life estate, Mr. Alden said, meaning Mrs. Merrick has a right to live on and use the property for the remainder of her life. When she passes, the property transfers to Hannah in fee simple. Doreen smiled at me across the table. It was the first time I realized a smile could feel like a door closing. For the next 2 years, I worked the farm. I don't mean I helped. I mean I worked it. Cole and Travis drove into town in my father's old pickup and came back smelling like beer and cigarette smoke. Doreen ran her small business selling vintage furniture out of the old machine shed, a business my father had built her with his own money the year before he died, and I ran the rest. I learned how to rotate the cattle through pastures without chewing the grass down to the roots. I learned how to patch a tractor tire with nothing but rubber cement and determination. I learned how to read the sky the way my grandfather had taught me, and more than once I saved our hay crop, because I could feel a storm coming 3 days out when the weather service was still saying clear and dry. Nobody thanked me. That wasn't part of the arrangement. What was part of the arrangement, I slowly realized, was that Doreen was selling things, small things at first. A set of my grandfather's hand tools she said were just cluttering up the barn, a John Deere Model B that had belonged to my father since he was a teenager. Then bigger things. She took out a second mortgage on the house. She leased the west quarter of our land to a corn operation from 3 counties over, and she pocketed the lease money in an account I wasn't allowed to see. I asked her about it once. Just once. I was 16, and I came in from the barn one evening with my hands still smelling like diesel, and I said, as politely as I knew how, "Doreen, I was wondering if we could talk about the lease on the west quarter." She looked at me over her reading glasses. She was sitting at my father's desk, going through a stack of what I now realized were probably deed records, and she said, in a voice as flat as a creek stone, "Hannah, you are a minor. I am your legal guardian. These matters don't concern you. Is that understood?" I nodded. I was 16. What else could I do? But that was the night something shifted in me. That was the night I remember my grandfather on the porch saying the word stewardship, and I understood for the first time that what Doreen was doing was the opposite of what he'd meant. She wasn't watching the land. She was stripping it. So I started watching her. I don't want you to think I was some kind of prodigy. I wasn't. I was a farm kid with dirt under her fingernails and a 10th grade education. But I had one thing Doreen didn't know about. I had my grandfather's old footlocker. It was up in the attic, behind a stack of my grandmother's quilts, under a tarp my father had laid over the summer before he died. Nobody had touched it in years. I only knew it was there because when I was 12, my father had taken me up to the attic to show me a box of my mother's old books, and he pointed at the footlocker and said, "That was your grandpa's. There's nothing in it but papers. But don't you ever let anybody throw out. You hear me, Hannah? Don't you ever let them throw it out." I didn't understand then. I thought he was being sentimental. The fall I turned 17, I climbed up to the attic one Saturday when Doreen was in town and the boys were at a football game, and I opened that footlocker for the first time. Inside were papers. My father had been right about that, but they weren't the kind of papers I expected. They weren't photographs or letters or old birthday cards. They were documents, legal documents, neatly folded, tied with twine, labeled in my grandfather's careful block letter handwriting. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor for 2 hours that afternoon, going through them one at a time. And I want to tell you, I want you to understand that I didn't grasp everything I was reading. Not that first day, not even that first month. A 17-year-old girl doesn't open a deed book and instantly understand mineral rights, severed estates, water law, and the difference between surface title and subsurface title. I had to figure out piece by piece. In the weeks and months that came after, sitting in the public library after school, asking careful questions to a librarian named Mrs. Goodwin, who'd been my mother's friend once upon a time. But what I understood that afternoon was enough to make my hands shake. My grandfather had kept records, copies of everything, plat maps, old surveys, receipts from the county clerk, and one document in particular, a single yellowed page, folded into quarters, dated June of 1961, that I didn't fully comprehend, but which my grandfather had underlined twice in heavy pencil. Reservation of all mineral, oil, gas, and subsurface rights, in perpetuity, to the grantor and his heirs, successors, and assigns. I didn't know what it meant. Not then, but I folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of my coat, and I climbed back down the attic ladder, and I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. 3 weeks later, Doreen threw me out of the house. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been up since 4 a.m. helping one of the heifers through a difficult birth, and by the time I came in for breakfast, my clothes were soaked through with blood and birth fluid, and I was so tired I could barely see straight. Doreen was waiting at the kitchen table. Cole was there. Travis was there. And Mr. Alden, the thin lawyer with the thin mustache, was there too, with a stack of papers in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. "Hannah," Doreen said, in that soft, tired voice of hers. "Sit down. We need to have a conversation." I sat. I was too tired to do anything else. What Doreen explained to me that morning, with Mr. Alden nodding along like a man being paid to nod, was that my father's estate had turned out to be more complicated than originally thought. There were debts, she said, old debts, a balloon payment on the second mortgage she'd taken out after his death, unpaid property taxes from a parcel my father had bought in the late 90s, a lien from a farm equipment dealer that went back 6 years. And the simplest way to resolve all of it, she said, was for me to sign a quitclaim deed, right there at the table, transfer my remainder interest in the homestead to her. In exchange, she would take care of the debts. She would make sure I had a fresh start. She would, as she put it, free me from a burden I was too young to carry. I looked at Mr. Alden. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at Cole. He was smirking into his coffee cup. I looked at Travis. He was on his phone. And I thought about my grandfather, about the porch, about the word stewardship. Doreen, I said, as evenly as I could manage, I'd like to take this paper to another lawyer before I sign anything. She smiled, the door-closing smile. "Hannah," she said, "I'm afraid that isn't going to be possible. I've spoken with Mr. Alden and with your brothers, and we've all agreed that it's in everyone's best interest if this matter is resolved today. If you don't feel you can sign the deed, then I'm afraid you'll need to find other living arrangements. I've already been more patient with you than the law requires." That was how she said it. More patient than the law requires. I was 17. I had a 10th grade education. I was standing in the kitchen my grandfather had built in 1954, looking at a woman who wanted to take everything he'd left behind, and I didn't know a single thing about contract law or undue influence or the rights of a minor heir. But I knew one thing. I knew my grandfather hadn't folded that yellowed page into quarters and underlined it twice for no reason. "I'm not signing," I said. Doreen's face didn't change. She'd been expecting it. "Cole," she said. "Travis, help your sister pack." They packed me. That's the word for what happened. They went upstairs to my room, and they put my clothes and my books and my grandmother's quilt into 2 black garbage bags, and they carried them down to the front porch, and Cole set them on the top step like he was setting out the trash. Doreen walked me to the door herself. She stood in the doorway, the same doorway my father used to stand in, watching me come in from the barn on winter evenings, and she said, "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Hannah. I really am, but you brought this on yourself." She closed the door. I heard the lock turn, and I stood on the porch of my grandfather's house with 2 garbage bags and $42 in my pocket, and I watched my own breath come out in the cold October air, and for a long moment I didn't feel anything at all. Then I picked up the bags, and I started walking down the gravel drive toward the county road, and I thought about the yellow page folded into quarters in the inside pocket of my coat. Reservation of all mineral, oil, gas, and subsurface rights in perpetuity. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet, but I was going to find out. The first night, I slept in the feed shed behind the grain elevator in Coldwater. It wasn't heated, but it was out of the wind, and nobody came around after dark. I used my grandmother's quilt as a blanket and my spare jeans as a pillow, and I lay awake for most of the night listening to freight trains pass through town and thinking about my father. In the morning, I walked to the diner on Main Street, a place called Ruby's, where my mother used to take me for pancakes on my birthday, and I spent 3 of my $42 on a cup of coffee and a bowl of oatmeal. The waitress was a woman named Darlene, who'd known my mother. She looked at my garbage bags and my dirty coat, and she didn't say anything, but when she brought me my bill, the bowl of oatmeal had been crossed off. I ate slowly, because I didn't know when my next meal was coming. And while I ate, I did something I'd been thinking about since the moment Doreen locked the door behind me. I pulled out the yellowed page, and I laid it flat on the diner table, and I read it again. It was titled Deed of Reservation. It was dated June 14th, 1961. It was signed by my grandfather, Ruth Merrick, and by a man named Harlan Whitfield. And it was stamped by the county recorder's office in a town I'd never heard of, a town called Ashcroft, about 70 miles north of Coldwater. The body of the deed was dense with legal language, but the essential point was a sentence my grandfather had underlined twice: reservation of all mineral, oil, gas, and subsurface rights in perpetuity to the grantor and his heirs, successors, and assigns. Below that, in my grandfather's block letter handwriting, there was a note: for Hannah, if it ever comes to it, Ashcroft County, Book 47, page 312. Elias. I read the note 3 times. My grandfather had died when I was 9. I hadn't been born when this deed was signed. He couldn't have known, in 1961, that a girl named Hannah would exist 60 years later and would need this piece of paper. But the note was in his handwriting, and it said for Hannah. I sat in that diner for a long time, and I cried quietly into my coffee cup, and Darlene refilled it twice without saying a word. Then I stood up, and I picked up my bags, and I walked to the public library. Mrs. Goodwin had been the town librarian for 31 years. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and a pair of reading glasses that hung around her neck on a beaded chain, and she'd known my mother since they were both in grade school. When I walked into the library with my garbage bags and my bloodshot eyes, she looked up from her desk, and she took one long, slow look at me, and she said, "Hannah, come back to my office." I spent the entire day in Mrs. Goodwin's office. I told her everything: the will, the mortgage, the quitclaim deed, the morning Doreen had put my things in garbage bags, and the footlocker, and the yellowed page. Mrs. Goodwin listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat quietly for almost a full minute. Then she stood up, and she walked to her filing cabinet, and she pulled out a business card, and she handed it to me. "This is a woman named Ellen Rafferty," Mrs. Goodwin said. "She practices law in Ashcroft. She was a friend of your grandfather's. Not close, but she did some work for him in the 80s, after he inherited the back quarter from his brother. If anybody still alive knows what your grandfather was thinking in 1961, it's Ellen." I looked at the card. It was cream-colored, a little faded, with an address and a phone number, and the words Rafferty Law Office, Real Estate, Estates, and Land Title printed in a plain black font. "Mrs. Goodwin," I said, "I don't have any money. I can't afford a lawyer." She smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen in 2 days, and it did something to me I can't quite describe. "Hannah, She said, "You let me worry about that. Your grandfather helped me out a hard spot once, a long time ago. I've been waiting almost 40 years for a chance to pay him back. You go see Ellen. Tell her Marjorie Goodwin sent you, and tell her about the page." I took the bus to Ashcroft that afternoon. It cost me $11. I arrived at Ellen Rafferty's office just before closing time, with my garbage bags and my grandmother's quilt and the yellow page folded into the inside pocket of my coat, and a receptionist with kind eyes walked me into a small waiting room and told me Mrs. Rafferty would see me in a few minutes. When Ellen Rafferty finally came out to meet me, she was older than I expected, maybe 70, with white hair cut short and a face that looked like it had weathered a lot of things. She took one look at me and she said, "You must be Elias Merrick's granddaughter." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She sat down across from me. She poured me a cup of tea from a pot on her side table, and she said, "All right, Hannah, tell me what's brought you here." I told her all of it, and then I unfolded the yellow page, and I laid it on her desk. Ellen Rafferty put on her reading glasses. She read the page once. She read it again. She turned it over, examining the county recorder's stamp. She looked up at me, and she said very quietly, "Oh, Elias, you clever man." What Ellen Rafferty explained to me that evening, slowly, patiently, making sure I understood every piece before she moved on to the next, was this. In June of 1961, my grandfather had sold a parcel of land, not the homestead, a different parcel, a 120-acre tract up in Ashcroft County, about 70 miles north of Coldwater, that he'd inherited from his brother Ezra when Ezra died in a car accident in 1960. The parcel was marginal land, poor soil, too rocky for good farming. My grandfather hadn't wanted it, but Ezra had willed it to him, and in 1961, he'd sold it to a man named Harlan Whitfield for what Ellen said was a pretty fair price at the time, about $18 an acre. But when he sold it, he'd done something unusual. He'd severed the mineral estate. "Hannah," Ellen said, "do you know what mineral rights are?" I shook my head. She explained, "When a person owns a piece of land in most states, they own it in two layers. They own the surface, the dirt, the trees, the buildings, everything you can see and walk on. And they own what's underneath, the minerals, the oil, the natural gas, the coal, whatever might be buried in the subsurface. In most ordinary sales, both layers transfer together. But the law allows a seller to sever the two, to sell the surface while keeping the subsurface, or to sell the subsurface while keeping the surface. My grandfather had sold the surface of the Ashcroft parcel to Harlan Whitfield in 1961, but had reserved for himself and his heirs forever the mineral rights underneath. Why would he do that? I asked. Ellen smiled a small, tired smile. In 1961, probably because his brother had made him promise to. Ezra had gotten a letter from an oil company the year before he died. They were interested in surveying the area. Ezra thought there might be something underground. He told your grandfather not to let it go, no matter what. And your grandfather kept that promise. Is there something underground? Ellen took a long breath. Hannah, she said, about 6 years ago, a company called North Plains Energy began drilling exploratory wells in Ashcroft County. They found a natural gas formation, a significant one. Over the last 4 years, they've been leasing mineral rights from landowners all across the county at rates that have made a lot of people very wealthy. I felt something cold move through my chest. Your grandfather's parcel, Ellen said, is right in the middle of the formation, and according to this deed, the mineral rights belong to his heirs, which means, if his will was properly drawn, and if no subsequent transfer was executed. She stopped. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Hannah, who are your grandfather's heirs? I thought about it. My grandfather had one son, my father. My father had one child, me. My grandmother had died before my grandfather. Ezra had died childless. I said, I'm his only living heir. Ellen nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of, she said. Because if that's true, then you are sitting on top of what is almost certainly the single most valuable piece of property your family has ever owned. And your stepmother, based on what you've told me, has no idea it exists. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. What comes next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Ellen Rafferty did 3 things for me that night. First, she called a woman named Peggy who ran a boarding house 2 blocks from her office, and she arranged for me to stay there, at no cost to me, for as long as I needed. Peggy was a retired schoolteacher who took in girls from rough situations, and when she opened her door to me at 9 o'clock that evening, she took my garbage bags from my hands without a word and carried them up to a small clean room on the 2nd floor with a quilt on the bed and a window overlooking a maple tree. Second, Ellen drove me over to the Ashcroft County Courthouse the next morning, a Wednesday, and she walked me into the recorder's office, and she pulled book 47, page 312, and we stood at the counter under the fluorescent lights, and we looked at the original deed my grandfather had filed 65 years before. It was there, exactly as the yellowed page described it. The reservation of mineral rights, signed and sealed and stamped by the county recorder on June 14, 1961. Still on file, still legally binding, untouched by any subsequent transfer. Ellen requested certified copies. 3 of them. She paid the fee out of her own pocket. Third, she sat me down in a small conference room at her office that afternoon, and she began to explain in careful, patient detail exactly what we were going to do. Hannah, she said, I want you to understand something. The mineral rights are yours. That's not in question. But we have 2 separate problems to solve, and we need to solve them in the right order. She held up one finger. First problem, your stepmother. She has no legal claim to the Ashcroft mineral rights. Those were never part of your father's estate, because your grandfather held them separately from the homestead. But she will try to claim them the moment she finds out they exist. She'll say your father owned them. She'll say they pass under his intestate estate. She'll say her life estate in the homestead somehow extends to them. None of those arguments will hold up, but she'll make them, because she has a lawyer who'll do whatever she tells him. She held up a second finger. Second problem, the homestead itself. Your stepmother tried to get you to sign a quitclaim deed under what I would call, if I were being polite, highly questionable circumstances. A minor, alone, under duress, presented with a stack of papers and no independent counsel. We can challenge that. We can almost certainly have that entire transaction set aside. But we have to do it carefully, and we have to do it before she attempts anything else. She held up a third finger. Third problem. You are 17 years old. You don't have a place to live. You don't have a source of income. You don't have a guardian. The law allows for emancipation of a minor under certain circumstances, and I believe we can meet those circumstances. But we need to file paperwork immediately. I sat there listening, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I felt held. Not coddled, not protected. Held. The way a frame holds up a wall. The way a fence post holds up a gate. The way the land itself holds up everything that stands on it. Ellen, I said, I don't have any money. She waved a hand. Hannah, she said, your grandfather did some pro bono work for my firm back in 1987 when we were fighting a takings case against the state. He spent 2 weeks driving me around the county, introducing me to farmers who'd been affected. He didn't charge me a penny. He did it because he believed the land deserved somebody to speak for it. I'm going to speak for you now. Don't worry about money. We'll sort that out when there's something to sort. The next 6 weeks were the strangest 6 weeks of my life. I lived at Peggy's boarding house. I got a job washing dishes at a truck stop just outside Ashcroft. 6 hours a night, 5 nights a week, for a little over minimum wage. I finished the 10th grade assignments Mrs. Goodwin had mailed me in a thick manila envelope, sitting at the small desk in Peggy's upstairs room with a lamp that flickered when the wind blew hard outside. And every Saturday morning, I took the bus to Ellen Rafferty's office, and we worked. We pulled every document we could find. The original 1961 deed, my grandfather's probate file from 2015, my father's probate file from 2023, the second mortgage Doreen had taken out, the lease on the West Quarter, the records of equipment sales. Every piece of paper I'd sat on top of for 2 years without knowing what any of it meant. Ellen explained each document to me, slowly, Carefully, she made me take notes. She made me ask questions. She made me learn. And while we did that, she filed 2 petitions in the county court. The first was a petition for emancipation. It laid out my circumstances, the death of my father, the conduct of my stepmother, my ability to support myself through lawful employment, my intention to complete my education, and it asked the court to declare me a legal adult. The second was a petition to set aside the attempted quitclaim deed on grounds of undue influence and failure to provide independent counsel to a minor heir. Neither petition mentioned the Ashcroft mineral rights. Not yet. We hold that card close, Hannah, Ellen said. Your stepmother doesn't know about it. Her lawyer doesn't know about it. The longer they don't know, the stronger our position becomes. When the time is right, we'll lay it on the table. Until then, we work quietly. The emancipation hearing was scheduled for the first Monday in December. Doreen was required to be served with notice because she was still my legal guardian. Ellen arranged for the service to be made by the sheriff's office, and I heard from Mrs. Goodwin, who heard from Darlene at the diner, that Doreen had thrown the papers at the sheriff's deputy and slammed the door in his face. I didn't go home in those 6 weeks. Not once. But I drove past the farm one Sunday afternoon in Peggy's old Ford, with Peggy herself in the passenger seat. We didn't stop. We just drove slowly past a gravel driveway, and I looked at the house my grandfather had built, and I looked at the bar my father had painted the summer before he died, and I looked at the wheat stubble in the near field, and I understood something for the first time. The land missed me. I could feel it, the way you can feel when a room has been empty too long. I was going home. I just didn't know it yet. The hearing happened on a cold, bright December morning in the Coldwater County Courthouse. Ellen had prepared me carefully. She told me what to wear, a plain navy sweater, and a pair of dress pants Peggy had bought me at a thrift store. She told me how to sit. She told me how to speak when the judge asked me questions. She told me not to look at Doreen, no matter what Doreen said or did. I walked into the courtroom at 9:15, and I sat at a table next to Ellen, and I kept my hands folded in my lap. Doreen sat at the opposite table with Mr. Alden. She was wearing a black dress and a string of pearls I recognized. They had belonged to my grandmother, and my father had given them to my mother on their 10th anniversary. Seeing them around Doreen's neck was the closest I came, in that whole long morning, to losing my composure. Cole and Travis sat in the front row of the gallery. So did a handful of neighbors. Mrs. Goodwin was there. Darlene from the diner was there. And in the very back row, sitting alone, was an old man in a canvas coat I didn't recognize at first, until he turned his head, and I saw his face. It was Walter Briggs, my grandfather's oldest friend. Ellen had called him. Walter was 78 years old, and he had driven 3 counties over to be in that courtroom. The judge was a woman named Judge Hollister. She had gray hair and reading glasses, and a manner that reminded me a little of Mrs. Goodwin. She called the emancipation petition first. Ellen stood up. She presented the case quietly and clearly. She described the conditions of my father's death, the behavior of my stepmother, the attempted quitclaim deed, my employment history, my academic record, my capacity to manage my own affairs. When Ellen finished, Mr. Alden stood up. He argued that I was a troubled girl, that I had rejected the care of my stepmother, that emancipation would be inappropriate for a 17-year-old with no means of support and no plan for the future. Judge Hollister listened. Then she looked at me. Miss Merrick, she said, is there anything you would like to tell the court in your own words? I stood up. I was shaking. I want to tell you I was brave, but I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I was 17 years old, and I was standing in a courtroom with my stepmother staring daggers at me from across the room, and I was about to say things I had never said out loud to anyone except Ellen Rafferty. I took a breath. I thought about my grandfather on the porch. Your Honor, I said, my grandfather taught me a word when I was a little girl. He taught me the word stewardship. He said the land wasn't ours. He said we were just the ones who got to watch it for a while. For 2 years since my father died, I have tried to be the steward of our farm. I have fed the animals. I have mended the fences. I have brought in the hay. I have cared for the land the way my grandfather taught me to care for it. I have done this because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone paid me. I did it because my grandfather told me that's what the land deserves. I paused. I looked at the judge. My stepmother threw me out of my grandfather's house 6 weeks ago because I wouldn't sign a paper she wanted me to sign. I didn't know what the paper meant. I just knew my grandfather wouldn't have wanted me to sign it, and I knew if I signed it without understanding it, I wasn't being a steward. I was being a coward. Judge Hollister said nothing. She was watching me steadily. I am asking the court, I said, to let me be the steward my grandfather raised me be. I can support myself. I am supporting myself. I have a job. I have a place to live. I have a lawyer. I have finished my 10th grade coursework by correspondence, and I intend to finish high school. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for the right to make my own decisions. Thank you, Your Honor. I sat down. Judge Hollister was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Miss Merrick." She granted the emancipation from the bench. It took her less than 2 minutes. And then Ellen stood up again and she said, "Your Honor, if it please the court, I would like to move directly to the matter of the quitclaim deed. I have new evidence to present." Judge Hollister nodded. Ellen walked to the front of the courtroom. She placed a folder on the clerk's table, and then she began to speak. This is the part one have to tell you slowly, because it mattered. It mattered the way a sunrise matters. You have to see each color come up in order, or you miss the whole thing. Ellen began with the homestead. She laid out the history. My grandfather's construction of the house in 1954. My father's inheritance in 2015. My father's intestate death in 2023. My stepmother's life estate. My remainder interest. The attempted quitclaim deed of October, 6 weeks earlier, signed under duress in the presence of her 2 adult sons and a lawyer with an active attorney-client relationship with the stepmother herself. She asked the court to set aside the quitclaim. She cited case law. She cited statutes. She cited a specific ruling from a state Supreme Court, only 5 years old, that directly addressed attempted transfers by minor heirs under conditions nearly identical to mine. Mr. Alden objected. Judge Hollister overruled him. Ellen continued. "Your Honor," she said, "there is one further matter the court should be aware before ruling on the quitclaim. It does not directly pertain to the homestead, but it pertains to the conduct of the stepmother, and it bears on the question of undue influence. May I approach?" "You may." Ellen handed a folder to the clerk, who handed it to Judge Hollister. Judge Hollister opened it. Inside were certified copies of the 1961 deed, the reservation of mineral rights, the records from the Ashcroft County Recorder's Office. Judge Hollister read for about 2 minutes. Her face didn't change. But I was watching her hands, and I saw her thumb pause a certain line, and I saw her look up briefly at Doreen, and I saw something in her expression shift in a way I cannot describe, except to say that it was the way my grandfather used to look at a man who had just told a lie he didn't know he'd told. "Mrs. Rafferty," the judge said, "please explain these documents to the court for the record." Ellen explained, calmly, precisely, without theatrics. She explained that in 1961, Elias Merrick had sold a 120-acre tract in Ashcroft County to a man named Harlan Whitfield. She explained the reservation of mineral rights. She explained that those rights had never been transferred. She explained that they passed intact to Elias Merrick's son, and then, upon his intestate death, to his only living child. She explained that under the laws of the state, those rights were not part of the homestead. They were held separately. They had never been part of my father's probate estate. My stepmother had never had any claim to them. Not then, not now, not ever. And she explained that in the past 4 years, North Plains Energy had been paying lease rates on comparable mineral rights in Ashcroft County that ranged. She gave a number, and I watched Doreen's head turn slowly toward the front of the courtroom. From $600 to $1,400 per acre per year, plus royalties on any production. 120 acres. The room went very, very quiet. Mr. Alden's face had gone an odd color. Cole, in the front row of the gallery, had sat up straight for the first time all morning. Travis had put his phone away. Doreen was staring at Ellen like she'd been struck across the face. "Your Honor," Ellen continued, in the same even voice. I do not raise this matter to claim damages. The mineral rights are not at issue in this hearing. They belong to Miss Merrick as a matter of uncontested record. I raise them because they establish context. The stepmother attempted to obtain my client's signature on a general quitclaim deed, drafted by her own attorney, under circumstances that did not permit my client to seek independent counsel. The scope of that deed, as drafted, would have transferred any and all interest my client holds or may hold in any real property, anywhere, to the stepmother, including, though the stepmother may not have known it, the Ashcroft County mineral estate. Ellen paused. Whether she knew or didn't know is beside the point, Your Honor. The point is this: a deed of that scope, executed by a minor under duress, without independent counsel, in favor of a step-parent with conflicting interest, is voidable on its face. The court should set it aside, and the court should, I respectfully submit, refer the attempted transaction to the state bar for review of Mr. Alden's conduct. Mr. Alden was sweating. Doreen had not moved. Judge Hollister took off her reading glasses. She folded them carefully on the bench in front of her. She looked at Doreen for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, The quitclaim deed is set aside. The minor's remainder interest in the homestead is restored in full, and I am taking Mrs. Rafferty's recommendation regarding the state bar under advisement. Mr. Alden, I would strongly encourage you to retain your own counsel. We are adjourned. She brought down the gavel. Doreen didn't look at me as I left the courtroom. She didn't look at Ellen. She didn't look at anyone. She sat at the table while the rest of the room emptied out, and she stared at the certified copies of the 1961 deed, and her hand had gone up to her throat, to the string of pearls that had belonged to my grandmother, and she was holding them the way a person holds a railing when they think they might fall. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you what I saw in her face, because it is a part of this story I have thought about most often in the years since. I had expected to see anger. I had expected to see that hard, closed look she used to wear at the kitchen table when the bills came in. I had expected defiance. What I saw instead was something I had never seen on her face in the 6 years I had known her. I saw exposure. I saw a woman whose entire story about herself had just been read aloud in a public courtroom and found to be something other than what she had believed it was. I saw the small, frightened woman underneath the hard one. I saw, for the first time, why she had married my father. Not because she had loved him, though I think she did in her way, but because he had been for her a kind of shelter. And when he died, the shelter had come down and she had panicked, and she had grabbed for whatever she could find to hold up the walls. I didn't feel sorry for her. I want to be clear about that. You can understand a thing without excusing it. You can see why a person did what they did without agreeing that they should have done it. What I felt, watching her across that courtroom, was the first flicker of something my grandfather would have recognized. The feeling of standing on a piece of ground so much older than you that your own anger feels very small in comparison. Cole and Travis left quickly. They didn't speak to me. They didn't speak to their mother. They walked out the side door of the courthouse and got into my father's old pickup, and they drove away. And as far as I know, neither of them ever set foot in that courthouse again. I walked out the front door with Ellen, and with Mrs. Goodwin, and with Walter Briggs. Walter put his hand on my shoulder. It was the first time he had touched me since my grandfather's funeral 8 years earlier. "Hannah girl," he said, "your granddad will be proud of you today." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. We stood on the courthouse steps in the cold, bright December air, and Ellen looked at me and she said, "There's still work to do, but the worst is behind you. What happens now?" I asked. Ellen smiled. "Now," she said, "we go to Ashcroft. We file a clean title on your mineral rights. We open negotiations with North Plains Energy on your own terms. And then we figure out what kind of life you want to build. I want to tell you what happened to Doreen, because I think you deserve to know. She didn't lose the house. I want to say that first. Her life estate was separate from the quitclaim deed, and her life estate remained valid. She had the legal right to live on the farm for the rest of her natural life. She kept that right, but she lost almost everything else. The second mortgage she'd taken out came due, and without access to the mineral rights she'd briefly believed would be hers, she couldn't pay it. The bank foreclosed on her personal business, the vintage furniture operation and machine shed, and sold off the inventory at auction. Mr. Alden was disbarred the following March, after the State Bar completed its review of the attempted quitclaim. He was not her lawyer by then. No lawyer in the county would take her calls. Cole moved to a city 3 states away. He got a job at a warehouse. I don't know much more than that. Travis stayed around for a while. He worked at the grain elevator in town. 6 months after the hearing, he showed up at the farmhouse on a Sunday evening. I was home by then, living in my grandfather's old house with Doreen, under a court-supervised arrangement Ellen had negotiated, and he stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, and he said, "Hannah, I'm sorry for all of it. I was a piece of work. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say it." I looked at him. I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the smirk in his coffee cup. "Travis," I said, "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet, but I can thank you for saying it." He nodded. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. "She's not well, you know," he said, meaning his mother. "She doesn't come out of her room anymore. She won't talk to me. She won't talk to Cole. I don't know what's going on with her. I just thought you should know." I didn't say anything. He walked down the porch steps and got in his truck and drove away. Doreen lived with me in that house for another 4 years. That's how long it took for her heart to give out a slow thing, quiet, not dramatic. She never apologized. She never acknowledged what she had done. She barely spoke to me in all those 4 years. We lived like 2 women in a boarding house who happened to share the same kitchen. But on the last night of her life, in a hospital room in the county seat, with me sitting in a chair beside the bed because there was nobody else to sit with her, she opened her eyes and she looked at me, and she said, in a voice I could barely hear, "Hannah, I was so afraid of being nothing." I didn't know what to say. I held her hand. "Your father was kind to me," she said. "I didn't deserve it. And when he died, I thought if I didn't take something, I would disappear. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," I said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know it doesn't count for anything now, but I'm sorry." She closed her eyes. She died about 2 hours later, around 3 o'clock in the morning. I was still holding her hand. I want to tell you, I felt triumph. I didn't. I felt tired. I felt the kind of tired that comes from carrying a thing so long that when you finally set it down, your arms don't know what to do with themselves. But I also felt, and this is the part that matters, I also felt free. Not free of her. Free of the story she had tried to tell about me. Free of the version of Hannah Merrick that stood on the porch with 2 garbage bags and $42 in her pocket, believing she was worthless. I was 21 years old. I was sitting in a hospital room in the county seat. And I was finally, completely, the steward my grandfather had raised me to be. The mineral rights turned out to be worth a great deal. I don't want to give you the exact number, because it isn't the point of the story, and because I have never been the kind of person who talks about money. But it was enough. Enough to pay off every debt on the homestead. Enough to restore the barn my father had loved. Enough to plant the wheat I'd been dreaming about since I was 10 years old, in the fields my grandfather had walked with his Korean War limp on summer evenings. Enough, also, to do what I've been waiting almost my whole life to do. I bought back the West Quarter. The lease Doreen had signed with the corn operation from 3 counties over had 7 years left to run when she died. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.